The kind invitation to give this opening lecture. It's a great honor. I'll see in how far I can really deal with all the aspects that we have shown in the different titles of the master programs. My talk is on geography, violence, conflict, which was added, and planetary futures. In 1994, already quite some time back, the American journalist Robert Kaplan, a very influential figure, published a highly influential and controversial essay with the title The Coming Anarchy. In this essay, later to be published in book format, you see the title here, Kaplan suggested to map out how scarcity, crime, overpopulation, tribalism, and disease are rapidly destroying the social fabric of our planet. That was the subtitle of his essay. Kaplan had returned from a journey to Africa, the dark continent, where he saw mass violence, decreasing resources, and a growing population struggling for survival. Roughly 10 years later, the cryptogeographer Jared Diamond published a thick book called Collapse. Therein, Diamond showed numerous historical examples of past societal disintegration and collapse as a result of environmental degradation and escalating scarcity. More recently, Gwyn Dyer, a Canadian journalist, wrote an apocalyptic book about future climate wars, and a similar titled book was soon after published in German by Harald Welzer, Klimakriege, and I just noticed it has now also been translated into English. What unites these writings is a sense of an apocalyptic future that we are to expect. And this future is generated through scarcity and the struggle over the remains of this scarcity. Such apocalyptic futures feature prominently in public talk about climate change and the future of our planet. One core narrative is that climate change will lead to hotter climates, which in turn will make resources scarcer, especially in in regions which suffer already from scarcity. Climate change is just the trigger these narratives suggest that will make this into a terrible future, igniting violent conflict and mass displacement on an unprecedented scale. Interestingly, these imaginations are generated from the past and the present. We could say that these narratives are anticipating the future in the present or the past. Welzer, for example, divides his book into three parts. The first part is how to kill yesterday, the second part is how to kill today, and the third part is titled how to kill tomorrow. One telling example of how the future is anticipated in the present is the following statement by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who said in 2007 that the Darfur conflict began as an ecological crisis arising in part from climate change. So in a sense, Darfur is the future already in the present. Harald Welzer, in his Climate Wars book, complies with this view on the Darfur crisis. Also, the very influential German Advisory Council on Global Environmental Change published a policy report with the title Climate as a Security Risk, where the council writes that climate change enhances mechanisms that trigger violence and insecurity. One telling example the Council mentions is the so-called Sahel conflict constellation. I'll come back to this one. So these statements suggest the following rationale. If we want to know how the future is likely to look like, we have to look at some sites in the world where the apocalyptic future is already here today, in the present, or has been here in the past. In this sense, apocalyptic places of violence and anarchy, such as Darfur, but also Somalia, Rwanda, are real-life laboratory sites where the future can be imaginatively anticipated. they become imagined geographies of the future. And this future is governed by scarcity of resources. Scarcity triggers struggles for survival, and therefore future wars will be fought by desperate populations in their struggle to survive. They will be climate wars. I think such imagined geographies of climate wars are false. They are false because they are based on a presupposition of assumed social mechanisms that displace a quasi or soft environment determinism, which leads from scarcity almost inevitably to violence. And as key witness, these present sites of violence and social anomie are invigorated as mirrors of the future. These presumed laboratory sites of apocalyptic presence, that's my argument, do not follow this script that these writings imagine, however. The script is more subtle and complex, because the geographies of violence are not as crypto-determinist as these writings want us to believe. These imagined geographies are not only false, as I will show, they are also dangerous. Dangerous because they inscribe a specific cartography or cartographic imagination of danger, where by placing the future apocalypse into the present, in specific present sites, anticipatory action is directed to these sites, rather than elsewhere. It's dangerous because it produces a regionalization which maps out the global south, Africa, Central Asia, as hotspots in a true sense of violence and insecurity. Okay, let us look at Welzer's book Climate Wars, because he uses Darfur as a laboratory site of the present to anticipate how future climate wars will look like. Harald Welzer locates the conflict causes in Darfur in a clash of civilizations between Arab pastoralists and African sedentary peasants. He suggests that after the 1984 drought in the Sahel, these peasants enclosed their farmland and excluded the pastoralists who were forced to migrate further to the south in search for pastures as a result of the moving desertification frontier. As desertification moved south, so had the pastoralists. The pastoralists lost their grazing land and had to fight their way through the enclosed lands of the peasants. It's not only, it seems, a fight between pastoralists and farmers, but between cultures and civilizations. It reminds us a bit of Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. If you look closer, we can see that Welzer applies a very specific analytic to his laboratory site, one that is misconceived but shared by a variety of authors. Welzer builds on Jared Diamond, whom I mentioned as well, and his concept of ecocide, which the latter developed in his book Collapse, where he describes how societal disintegration is identified as a result of escalating scarcity. This scarcity creates desperation and moves different peoples beyond the usual spatial confines of their livelihoods. They migrate, they are displaced, and where in their new places they meet upon other people struggling and fighting for the few remaining resources. In this imagination, violence becomes an affect of desperation and a strategy of survival. Welzer suggests that violence, as a mechanism of human relations, is always simmering beneath the surface. So we are civilized here, but our true nature is to be violent, potentially. And in times of crisis, Welzer suggests, in this particular case, in a crisis of scarcity, this violence erupts to the open. These authors are not the first one to put scarcity in the center of the analysis of violent conflict. Already in the 1990s, Thomas Huber-Dixon published a book with the title Environment, Scarcity and Violence. I think the title says everything about his research program. But Homer Dixon was careful to propagate a simple deterministic equation between scarcity and violence. He said, of course, I'm cleverer than that. Rather, he suggested societies could develop mechanisms to adapt to scarcity through technological change, for example. But the problem was that many conflict-affected countries in the global south, they lacked the means to develop these capacities to adapt to such scarcities. And that's why, in those cases, scarcity triggered violence. And similarly, the German Advisory Council on Global Environmental Change, which I mentioned before, identifies a variety, what he calls conflict constellations, where each of these different constellations is likely to have specific security implications in various places that span the globe. So they regionalize this scarcity mechanism. Geography seems to matter in terms of how climate-induced change disrupts social cohesion in different places and constellations. And the important thing is that, of course, also the Advisory Council says we are not determinists, because that's too primitive, but they conclude that such conflict constellations are likely to increase in numbers and intensity, leading to a more fragile globe and more environmental conflicts to emerge. So all these contributions share a common narrative that scarcity will put societies under stress who are already fragile, and thereby bring to the fore violent struggles for survival. Remember, Welser said, we have the inclination to become violent when there's a crisis. So many of these contributions share some of the assumptions that Harald Welser spelled out. But often these, in other writings, they are more implicit. So Welser writes that it's mainly countries with low levels of wealth, so-called developing countries, which are more vulnerable to violent conflict. Also, if you look at where civil wars are fought, they are mainly in so-called backward countries. And the second point is, which I mentioned already before, that violence as a mechanism of social relations is always already simmering in the background, just waiting to find fertile grounds to erupt. And for Welser and others, this scarcity, when it reaches a certain threshold, is just the trigger to bring this violence to erupt. There is a but to this story. I argue that the scarcity reading of the Darfur crisis that Welser advances, but also of the environmental conflict literatures more broadly, needs qualification. Its argumentation is logically flawed, even if we follow its own inherent rationale. For example, studies have shown that an analysis of rainfall patterns doesn't show a correlation between the time period of a drought and the incidence of violent conflict in Darfur. The decline of rainfall patterns started already in the 1970s without triggering violent conflict. Why then did violence erupt only in 2003, when rainfall patterns were wetter, so better, more rainfall than in the 1970s and 1980s? Welser and others do not seem to have convincing answers to this question. Second, the motivational rationale that Welser and others suggest as an explanation for the Darfur War is in itself logically flawed. If you have the image in mind that people struggle and fight for the last remaining resources, and that this was the main trigger for violence in Darfur, it's difficult to explain why the so-called Arab militias used a scorched earth campaign, looting and burning all local resources, even burning all trees in their way in Darfur. Were these militias fighting for access to these resources? What sense would it make to just destroy those resources that they have just successfully conquered in order to survive? So even if we follow their own arguments, we can see that they are logically incoherent. And I think that what these observations suggest is that there are other reasons for the outbreak of this violence and violence in other places. And these are mainly political reasons and political mechanisms at work that have little to do with the imagination of desperate people struggling for survival. Violence is not the desperate effect of the losers, but a specific strand of spatial politics. Okay, let us now look at the second laboratory site, which I am more familiar with because I have done research there and also collaborated with other researchers. And that's the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa seems to concur with the image that the German Advisory Council identifies as Sahel conflict constellation, which looks pretty similar to the Darfur crisis. So the Council writes that climate change produces environmental stress and social crisis that will further destabilize an already fragile social equilibrium of weak states, civil wars and acute poverty. So that's exactly, they even mention Somalia, what the image they have in mind of Somalia. And when you listen to the news, Somalia appears as a pretty hopeless place, deteriorating in social anomie, hunger and desperation. The so-called Somali apocalypse, as Christian Parenti writes. These geographical imaginations of a Sahel conflict constellation are misleading, however. I concur with the argument of geographer Matthew Turner, who suggested that herders and farmers in the Sahel have a long history of social and economic relations which are mutually co-constitutive. Herders use cultivated fields as pasture, while the dung of their animals provides useful fertilizers for the fields of the farmers. Resource conflicts have been embedded in this genealogy of social relations. These relations can be conflictive, have also been violent in the past, but equally there have been established mechanisms of de-escalation and resolution of such conflicts. And if these mechanisms have failed, like for example in the case of Darfur, but also in some situations in Somalia, this is largely the result of politics and geopolitics, but not triggered by the crisis of scarcity. So let me illustrate Turner's point by looking into the laboratory side of Somalia, building on material from a number of studies conducted by various geographers on the Somali region in Ethiopia. So that's the Somali part of Ethiopia, not the Somalia part of the former state of Somalia. But this area is closely related to the Somalia part of Somalia. And I would like to emphasize three key dynamics in these geographies of violence. First, the time geography of violent events. Second, the geographies of resource commodification. And third, the geopolitics of resource access and territorialization. So let us first look at the time geography of violent events. If we look at the time genealogy of when violence occurs, this seems to show that it's not primarily scarcity that drives violence, but strategic clan politics of territorial control. Research of some of my colleagues in Zurich and Ethiopia has shown that violence rarely occurs during periods of acute scarcity. You also remember the analysis of rainfall patterns in Darfur. In this situation of scarcity, of drought, pastoralist groups of neighboring clans tend to share whatever resources are left with their brothers. Fighting and raids occur during the rainy season when resources are plentiful. Fighting and raiding takes place because different clans try to expand their territorial control. And Tobias Hagmann has shown that this quest to control territory has become important because the Ethiopian state's decentralization policy has given limited powers to regional governments, and these offer patronage resources, which are largely clan-based, and again, the distribution of these resources, the distribution of political power depend on the control of territory, because that determines how many seats you have in parliament, for example. So territorial expansion therefore means more political assets in this struggle for state resources. Second, if you look at geography, or more precisely, the geographies of resource commodification or enclosure. Enclosure means the erection of physical boundaries, fences in most cases, around formerly commonly held resources in order to claim private user rights. Whereas so-called the concept of property doesn't really apply in the sense of private property. The land still belongs to the clan, but it's about defining exclusive private user rights to a specific piece of land. And this has been done by powerful clan members. They might have created enclosures just as fair and complete as a fact, violating existing clan rules. In other cases, a clan might have decided to subdivide their clan territory into individually held slots. So why was this trend for enclosure of formerly commonly held land? Enclosures have been encouraged by two types of incentives. First, again, the process of territorialization, which I mentioned before. The state's gradual penetration into these pastoral areas increased the economic and political value of land beyond grazing land. So it was economically more viable to use that land for other things than just grazing land. And second, here geography comes in as well, because local things are often connected to things in different places, as we discussed in the seminar before. Economic incentives come also from beyond the nation state. In this case, the demand for fuel wood from the Middle East was essential, because fuel wood is marketed through the neighboring Somaliland to the Middle East. Wood on enclosed land can be sold to foreign entrepreneurs for a high price. So both the incentives of territorialization and of cash income has triggered violent clan conflicts, as these enclosures restrain the movement of livestock and thereby violate the reciprocity principle of inter-clan cooperation in times of crisis. Third, geopolitics, or the geopolitics of resource access and territorialization. Ricardo Beyene, Simone Redberg, and Bekele Hundir have all shown how the geopolitics of a greater Somalia, not only including the state of Somalia, but also the Somali territories in Ethiopia, has affected resource conflicts inside Ethiopia between Afar, Somali and Oromo pastoralists and agro-pastoralists. Somali clans of Isa used resource conflicts as a strategic means to expand their territorial control far into the regional state territories of Oromia and Afar inside Ethiopia. The Isa attacked and raided cattle from Oromo agro-pastoralists as well as from Afar pastoralists. And their campaigns were supported by their clan brothers who are the rulers in the neighboring state of Djibouti. And these clans in Djibouti offered modern weapons to the Isa, giving them a much stronger fighting force, which turned the equilibrium of power towards the Isa. And these attacks were part of this project to demarcate the territories of a greater Somalia. Okay, what does this short exploration into our laboratory site in the Horn of Africa suggest? First of all, violence conflict per se is nothing new in the Sahel. But the dynamics of these conflicts have changed in recent years due to changing geopolitical constellations, such as the proliferation of small arms, commodification processes, like the selling of fuel wood, and the state's project of territorialization, territorializing these peripheries and pastoralist lands. And second, these conflicts are not an expression of desperate survival struggles, but rather appeal to the heart of the political. The friend-enemy distinction, as Carl Schmitt has famously defined the political. Violent conflict has become a tool for power politics. In other words, violence does not erupt out of frustration or the struggle, desperate struggle for scarce resources, but is politics by other means, to paraphrase Clausewitz. Violence is not something that humans are subconsciously inclined to when scarcity instills stress on human societies. Such as social psychology, you remember Wälzer advanced this, such social psychology of environmental conflict is misleading. So let me be clear, I'm not a climate change denier of any sort. What I was aiming to show is that the social psychology models implicit in the imagined geographies of climate wars are false. They suggest a geographical imagination of violence as just an archaic, affective, spontaneous eruption of violence when scarcity reaches a threshold. In his excellent book, Critical Political Ecology, Tim Forsyth uses the term environmental orthodoxes to denote, I quote him here, general statements referring to environmental degradation or causes of environmental change that are often accepted as fact but have been shown by field research to be inaccurate. So these orthodoxes are generalized or commonly held narratives with a certain persistence that are based on flawed assumptions, models, or causalities, but which nevertheless continue to influence policy. And I suggest that the imagined geographies of climate wars that we can read in all this literature that I've shown you is such an environmental orthodoxy, one which ignores the complexities and geographies of environmental conflicts. But the problem is, this environmental orthodoxy of climate wars is not only false, it's also dangerous. It's here that I want to return to Turner's paper again, because it entails a second argument, one about the ethics of representation. This argument is dangerous, I said at the beginning of this lecture, because it produces a regionalization, which maps out the global south as hotspots of violence and insecurity. And this is what I call the imaginative geographies of climate wars. Imaginative geographies, suggest Edward Said in Orientalism, are mapped out on the basis of a demarcation of a familiar place that is ours from one that is theirs. And this mapping requires a dramatization of this difference and distance. Said laid out the cultural practices that produced Western knowledge about the Orient through what he called Orientalism. Similarly, we need to map out the political practices that produce scientific or policy knowledges about those hot places where violence comes up so often. Africa, Central Asia, and so on. The geographer Derek Gregory, building on Said's writings on imaginative geographies, has suggested that we see imaginative geographies as something performative, in the sense that they produce the effects that they name. If you talk long enough about climate wars, we might also find climate wars. So what kind of imaginations are at play in the imaginative geographies of climate wars? It's the threat imminent in the other, the place that is not Europe, not the US. It's the dark continent, most certainly Africa. This cartographic imagination of danger, as Simon Dalby calls it, locates the threat with the other with a capital O. It's a threat that the other poses to us. It's the anti-enlightenment, the dark face of humanity. This geographical imagination has a long tradition. The historical geographer David Livingstone has called this the climatic imagination, which you can trace back to such eminent thinkers as Immanuel Kant or David Hume, a tradition that views the tropical other as deficient, as inferior. Reading through the climate wars literature, we might detect many such climatic imaginations. about the threat of migrating masses from Africa coming to Europe, of disintegrating societies that end in archaic killings and brute violence. These are primitive movements, primitive wars in hot zones, wars that we in the West consider as uncivilized mass violence. I won't comment on the question whether the wars that the West fights out in various similarly hot places like Afghanistan or Iraq have been more civilized. The wars the West has been fighting have certainly been characterized by a more modern technology. Okay, ingrained in these imaginative geographies is also the belief that our apocalyptic future is already here, today, in the present, in these laboratory sites that dispose the dark side of human existence. As if we witnessed a return to a kind of Hobbesian kind of state of nature, a state of nature characterized by a war of all against all. For Thomas Hobbes, the Enlightenment philosopher, the state of nature could only be overcome through a Leviathan, an absolutist ruler, an authoritarian sovereign who imposes rule and ends the insecurity of daily life in the state of nature. This is perhaps a second hidden implication of the imaginative geographies of climate wars. The apocalyptic future that is already embodied in certain sides of the present requires governing through a strong sovereign who imposes a state of exception to counter the threat of an apocalyptic future. But we should probably be more afraid of this climate Leviathan than about a future that can be shaped in manifold ways. For the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, the state of nature and the state of exception are nothing but two sides of the same topological process in which what was presupposed as external, the state of nature, which is to be overcome in society, now reappears in the inside as state of exception. And the danger of a climate Leviathan lies in the projection of a potential state of nature from the future into the present, whereby the state of nature reappears inside our society as a state of exception, as a particular form of governing the climate future already in the present. But Agamben warns us, exception and rule, Hobbes' state of nature, the lawless rule of violence, and the state of law, civilization and modernity, cannot be easily separated. They are becoming indistinguishable, as the sovereign embodies the state of nature inside himself as violence without order. Through imaginations of an apocalyptic future, of a state of nature to come, this confusion travels to the present and shapes our ideas of governing climate futures in the present. Perhaps through a planetary sovereign. But what kind of sovereign are we to expect under conditions of planetary crisis and imaginations of future apocalypse? The danger is that the imagined state of exception is likely to end up in a paradigm of security as the normal technique of government, as Agamben writes. So let me conclude. The task of geography should probably be to unimagine those apocalyptic futures, to replace them with alternative visions, both of our imaginations and of climate politics, and to do this based on field research, as Tim Forsyth suggested. Ironically, Robert Kaplan, you might remember, the guy who wrote The Coming Anarchy, who recently wrote a paper titled The Revenge of Geography. Kaplan suggested that physical geography, terrain, determined the fate of societies. Kaplan wrote that the wisdom of geographical determinism endures. A very interesting thesis, because it recognizes that the most profound struggles of humanity are not about ideas, but about control over territory. The range of geography, in Kaplan's terms, means that resource geographies shape humanity's future, mainly towards misery. In this sense, Kaplan remains loyal to what he wrote in The Coming Anarchy 15 years ago. I agree with Kaplan that it's time for geography to take revenge, but a different kind of revenge than Kaplan had in mind when framing the metaphor of geographical determinism. Rather, geography should take revenge on a crypto-environmental determinism. Yes, I agree with Kaplan. Many violent struggles are fought over the control of territories. And I've shown you the example of Somalia, how these different geographies of territorialization can work out. But this is not about ecology, physical geography, or terrain, but about the political, as Carl Schmitt has defined it. Ironically, though, Kaplan takes politics out of geopolitics, as does the climate wars narrative take the political out of political ecology. However, political geographers such as Simon Dalby, Klaus Dodds, John Agnew, David Campbell, Gerard Toll have for a long time argued that there's nothing natural about geography. Geography as an academic discipline should therefore take revenge on a crude geodeterminism, a static geography of climate wars, and replace it with an approach which studies the multiple geographies of environmental change, their complexities, their genealogies, and the multiple trajectories of how different people live in different places in the present, whatever the future might bring. Okay, thank you very much.